Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something soft and slow, a season of a life that so many of you have written in about, that first quiet year of being married in 1950s America. Thank you to everyone who requested this one. Your comments and suggestions genuinely shape where this channel goes, and this topic came up again and again, so tonight is for you. Before we begin, if this kind of gentle, immersive history is something you enjoy, a like and a comment truly helps this little channel keep growing. And if you would rather listen than watch, we are also now on Spotify, so feel free to find us there through the link in the description and settle in that way instead. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. Pull the blanket up. There is nowhere you need to be right now except right here. What did it actually feel like to move into your very first apartment together in 1955? What did the kitchen smell like on a Tuesday morning when you were both still learning how the other took their coffee? What did it feel like to hang your first set of curtains, to fold someone else's shirts for the first time, to sit across a small table together at the end of a long day? What did Sunday afternoons look like when the whole world seemed to slow down just for you two? And just like that, it is 1955. There is a faint smell of toast and percolating coffee drifting through a small kitchen. Somewhere outside, a screen door creaks shut. You are newly married, still learning the shape of this new life, and the morning is just beginning. You wake up in an apartment that still smells faintly of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, sunlight easing through thin curtains you picked out together only days before. For a moment you forget where you are, and then you remember, this is not a visit, this is not borrowed space, this is yours now, both of yours, and the realization settles over you slowly and warmly, like the blanket still tangled around your legs. The ceiling above you is unfamiliar in the way new places always are, a faint water stain near the corner that you have already decided to love rather than fix, at least for now. Somewhere beneath you, a floorboard creaks, though no one else is walking on it, the apartment simply settling into itself the way old buildings do, the way you are settling into this new version of your own life. You lie still for a moment, listening. There is a radiator ticking somewhere down the hall, a bird calling from the ledge outside, and beside you, the slow, even breathing of the person you promised yourself to only days ago. You turn your head and watch him sleep for a moment, still faintly amazed that this ordinary quiet scene now belongs to you both. His arm is thrown over the extra pillow. His hair is pressed flat on one side. There is nothing especially remarkable about the sight, and that is exactly what makes it remarkable. The plain, unglamorous truth of two people simply sharing a room, a bed, a beginning. You slip out from under the covers carefully, feet finding the cool wood floor, and pad quietly toward the window. Outside, the street is just beginning to stir. A milk truck idles 2 doors down, the driver setting bottles onto a neighbour's step with the practiced quiet of someone who has done this every morning for years. A woman across the way shakes out a rug from her balcony. It is an entirely unremarkable street on an entirely unremarkable morning, and yet you find yourself studying it as though memorising something important, because in a way you are. This is the street you will come to know by heart. This is the view that will become simply home. The apartment itself still carries the faint chemical sweetness of new paint, mixed now with the cardboard smell of boxes not yet unpacked, stacked along one wall like patient soldiers waiting for orders. You run a hand along the top of the nearest box, feeling the rough edge of the packing tape, and think about how strange it is that your whole life together currently fits into a dozen cardboard containers and one small bedroom. Behind you, the mattress shifts, and you hear him stir, a low, sleepy sound followed by the particular silence of someone slowly waking up in an unfamiliar room and trying to remember why. Morning, he murmurs, voice thick with sleep, and you turn back toward the bed, toward him, toward this life you have just begun building together. You climb back under the blanket for just a few more minutes, in no hurry yet to face the boxes or the empty cupboards, or the long list of small tasks that will fill this first week. For now, there is only this: sunlight creeping slowly across the floor, the smell of paint and cardboard and cotton sheets, and the quiet, unhurried comfort of two people, learning what it feels like to wake up as a family for the very first time. Somewhere out on the street, a screen door bangs shut, and a dog barks twice before falling silent again. The city is waking up around you, indifferent to the small, private significance of this particular morning, and somehow that indifference makes the moment feel even more tender, even more entirely your own. No one else knows this is your first morning here. No one else needs to. It is the kind of quiet that is harder to find now, a stillness before responsibility, before errands, before the day demands anything of you at all. You allow yourself to simply exist in it a little longer, tracing small circles against the sheet, listening to him breathe, feeling the newness of the apartment settle slowly into something that will, in time, feel less new and more simply like yours. Eventually you will rise. Eventually there will be coffee to make and boxes to unpack and a whole life to arrange piece by piece into something that fits the two of you. But not yet. For now there is only this soft, quiet beginning, sunlight on the floor, the smell of fresh paint fading slowly into something more familiar, and the steady, comforting presence of the person beside you. Both of you waking up for the very first time as husband and wife. The kitchen is small, barely big enough for two people to stand in at once, but it is entirely your own, and that fact alone makes every mismatched pot and borrowed mixing bowl feel like a small triumph. You spend the morning arranging things that do not yet have a proper place, deciding together where the coffee tin should live and which drawer belongs to the good silverware. The cabinets are a pale yellow, slightly chipped near the handles from whoever lived here before, and you run your fingers along the edges as you work, feeling the small imperfections that make the space feel lived in rather than simply borrowed. Sunlight slants through a single window above the sink, catching dust motes in the air as you unwrap dishes from newspaper, each plate emerging with a soft crinkling sound that has already become one of the small pleasures of this new life. You hold up two mismatched mixing bowls, one from your mother, one from his, and laugh quietly at how neither matches the other, deciding that this too is simply part of what a shared kitchen looks like in its first weeks. Nothing here was chosen as a complete set. Everything arrived from somewhere else. A wedding gift, a hand-me-down, a small purchase from the corner store, and slowly, piece by piece, it is becoming something that belongs distinctly to the two of you. He stands on a chair to reach the top shelf, insisting the good glasses belong there, out of easy reach, saved for company, while you argue gently that you would rather have them close at hand for ordinary Tuesday evenings. You compromise, as you're already learning to do, glasses on the middle shelf, easy enough to reach but still treated with a little ceremony. The icebox hums steadily in the corner, still mostly empty except for a bottle of milk and a small block of butter wrapped in wax paper. You open it more times than necessary throughout the morning, not because you need anything from inside, but because there is something satisfying about the small ritual of opening your own icebox and your own kitchen, still faintly unbelievable in its ordinariness. Drawers get filled slowly, one at a time. The everyday silverware goes into the drawer nearest the stove, within easy reach for quick meals. The good silverware, still wrapped in its felt lining from the wedding, goes into a drawer further away, saved for Sundays and visitors, though you both privately suspect it will end up used far more often than either of you originally planned. You unwrap the small set of dish towels, embroidered with tiny flowers by an aunt who insisted every new household needs proper linens, and hang them from the oven handle, standing back a moment to admire how instantly they make the space feel warmer, more finished, more like a home already lived in rather than one just beginning. The smell of the kitchen slowly changes as the morning goes on, less like cardboard and more like something faintly domestic, a trace of dish soap, the metallic scent of new pots still bearing factory shine, the faint warmth of sunlight against the counter. It is the kind of smell that will, in a year's time, simply mean home, though right now it still carries the newness of everything being figured out for the first time. By midday, the small kitchen is mostly arranged. Cabinets no longer a jumbled mystery, but a system only the two of you understand. Coffee here, plates there, the good silverware saved for Sundays. You stand together in the narrow space admiring the work, shoulders nearly touching in the tight quarters, and something about the smallness of the room makes the accomplishment feel larger somehow, more intimate, more entirely yours. It is the kind of ordinary domestic labour that will happen again and again over the coming years, cabinets rearranged, drawers reorganised, systems slowly refined. But this first arrangement carries a particular weight, the very first version of a kitchen that will feed you both for years to come. You close the last cabinet door and glance at him, flour dust already somehow on his sleeve though nothing has been baked yet, and think that this small, unglamorous room, with its chipped yellow cabinets and mismatched bowls, already feels more like home than anywhere else you've ever lived. It takes a few weeks before you stop being surprised by each other's routines, the way one of you reaches for the newspaper before anything else, the way the other needs the radio on low just to feel like the day has properly started. These small discoveries feel oddly intimate, more revealing somehow than anything said aloud. You learn, for instance, that he cannot properly wake up without at least 10 minutes of silence first, coffee in hand, staring at nothing in particular before he is ready to speak a full sentence. You, on the other hand, wake instantly, already thinking through the day's small tasks before your feet even touch the floor, and it takes him some getting used to, your quiet stream of morning chatter arriving before he has fully returned from sleep. The radio becomes part of the ritual almost immediately, a low murmur of music or news drifting through the kitchen while breakfast comes together, and you notice how he hums along under his breath without seeming to realise he is doing it, a habit that makes you smile quietly into your coffee cup most mornings. You learn which station he prefers, which announcer's voice makes him roll his eyes, which songs make him pause mid-motion, spoon halfway to his mouth simply to listen. He learns your habits in turn, the particular way you like your toast, barely browned, the way you always butter it while it is still warm enough to melt instantly, rather than waiting the extra minute for perfectly even coverage. He notices, without you having to say anything, that you prefer the window cracked slightly even on cooler mornings, that you like a few minutes of quiet before conversation, that you always check the small clock on the shelf twice before feeling settled into the day. There is something tender about this slow accumulation of knowledge, the discovery that marriage is built less from grand romantic gestures and more from 1,000 small observations quietly gathered over weeks and months. You learn that he likes his eggs simple, unseasoned beyond salt, while you prefer a bit of pepper. You learn that he reads the sports section first while you turn straight to the front page. Neither preference is remarkable on its own, but together they begin to sketch the outline of a life being built one small routine at a time. Some mornings there is a gentle friction in these differences, a brief disagreement over how loud the radio should be, a quiet huff when one of you takes slightly too long in the shared bathroom. But even these small frictions carry a strange sweetness. evidence that you are learning to fit your separate rhythms into something shared, adjusting gradually the way two instruments slowly tune themselves toward the same pitch. By the third week, you find yourselves anticipating each other without needing to ask, the coffee already poured to the right amount before he reaches for the cup, the newspaper already folded to the section he prefers before he sits down. It is the kind of quiet choreography that develops without either of you consciously deciding to learn it, simply through the accumulation of ordinary mornings spent side by side. You think, some mornings, about how strange and lovely it is that you now know these small, specific things about another person, details no one else in the world would think to notice or care about. The particular hum he makes along with the radio, the exact shade of brown he prefers his toast. These are not the things songs are written about, and yet they feel, in their own quiet way, like the truest evidence of intimacy, small and unglamorous and entirely real. It is the kind of knowledge that builds slowly and without ceremony, morning after morning, cup after cup, until one day you realize you know this person's rhythms as well as your own, and the realization settles over you gently, like sunlight finally reaching the far corner of a room it has been slowly warming all along. You walk down to the corner market with a short list written in careful handwriting, and something about doing this simple errand together, deciding between two brands of coffee, debating whether to splurge on a better cut of meat, makes the whole outing feel like its own small adventure. The market's only a few blocks from the apartment, close enough to walk, and the morning air still carries a faint coolness as you set off together, the folded list tucked into your coat pocket. The street is busy in the unhurried way of a weekday morning, a delivery boy balancing a crate of bread against his hip, a woman sweeping the front step of her shop, the distant clang of a trolley somewhere further down the avenue. Inside, the market smells like sawdust and fresh bread, and the faint metallic tang of the meat counter toward the back. Rows of canned goods line the shelves in careful stacks, labels bright and orderly, and you find yourself lingering a little longer than necessary in front of the coffee display, comparing prices, weighing the familiar brand against a cheaper one neither of you has tried. He picks up a can, turns it over, reads the label with unnecessary seriousness, and you laugh softly at the performance of it, this small domestic decision being treated with the gravity of something far more important. In truth, it is exactly that important, in its own small way, because every choice right now still carries the weight of newness, every decision another small brick laid in the foundation of how you will run this household together. At the meat counter, the butcher greets you both warmly, clearly recognizing new customers, and asks what the occasion is when you mention it is your very first proper grocery trip as a married couple. He offers a knowing smile and suggests a slightly better cut than you had planned to buy, insisting a good roast deserves to be celebrated properly, and after a quick glance between the two of you, a small nod of agreement, you decide to splurge just this once. Back among the aisles, you debate briefly over which brand of flour to buy, which soap smells best, whether the slightly more expensive butter is worth the extra coins. These decisions, so small and ordinary, carry a particular sweetness in these early weeks, because they're still new enough to feel like discoveries rather than routines. You are learning, item by item, what kind of household you are building together, what small luxuries matter to each of you, and which economies you're both willing to accept. The walk home is slower, weighed down slightly by the paper sacks you both carry, one in each arm, handles occasionally slipping so that you have to pause and readjust your grip. The afternoon sun has grown a little warmer now, and you take your time in no particular hurry, occasionally shifting a sack to free a hand so you can reach for his for a moment, before letting go again to keep your balance. Back in the small kitchen, you unpack everything together, finding places for each item in the cabinets you arranged only days before, the roast wrapped carefully and set into the icebox for tomorrow's dinner. There is something deeply satisfying about seeing the shelves slowly fill, evidence of a household beginning to take shape, evidence that you are in fact capable of doing this together, of managing a home, a budget, a life. It is the kind of ordinary errand that will happen dozens of times over the coming years. Grocery lists written and crossed off, aisles walked without much thought. But this first trip carries its own particular glow, still new enough to feel significant, still novel enough that even choosing a can of coffee together feels like something worth remembering. Money is tight in this first year, so the apartment fills slowly. A second-hand table here, a lamp from a great aunt there, a rug you saved 3 weeks to afford. Each piece carries its own small story, and though the rooms are sparse, they feel warmer with every addition. The table arrives first, delivered by a neighbour's brother with a truck. Scratched along one edge but sturdy, and you spend an entire evening rubbing linseed oil into the wood, watching the scratches soften and darken until they look less like damage and more like character. It becomes, almost immediately, the centre of the apartment, the place where meals happen, where the budget book gets opened each Friday, where conversations linger longest after the plates have been cleared. The lamp comes next, an ornate thing with a faded silk shade, sent by his great aunt who insisted every young couple needs proper light for reading in the evenings. It does not match anything else in the room, its brass base slightly tarnished, its shade a colour somewhere between rose and rust. But you place it beside the second-hand armchair anyway, and somehow its mismatched presence only adds to the charm of a room still being assembled piece by piece. The rug takes the longest to arrive, not because it is difficult to find, but because it requires saving. 3 weeks of setting aside a little extra from the household budget until finally you have enough. The day you bring it home is treated with genuine ceremony, both of you kneeling on the bare floor to unroll it carefully, smoothing out the creases from where it had been folded in the shop, standing back afterward to admire how instantly the room feels finished, how the bare wood floor suddenly feels like a proper living space, rather than simply an empty room waiting to become something. Other pieces arrive more slowly still, a bookshelf built by his father, uneven but sturdy, a set of curtains sewn by your mother from fabric you chose together at the dry goods store, a small side table found at an estate sale for almost nothing, its drawer sticking slightly in humid weather. None of these pieces would be considered fashionable or matched by any particular decorating standard, and yet together they begin to form something entirely coherent, a room that reflects not a single unified taste but the actual layered history of two families merging slowly into one household. You spend evenings rearranging furniture more times than seems strictly necessary, moving the armchair from one corner to another, testing whether the lamp looks better beside the window or near the bookshelf, debating whether the rug should sit centred or slightly closer to the fireplace. These small adjustments feel less like indecision and more like careful tending, the slow, attentive work of making a space feel truly yours rather than simply furnished. There is a particular satisfaction in earning each piece slowly rather than acquiring everything at once, a satisfaction that feels increasingly rare now, when a single afternoon and enough money can furnish an entire room without any of the waiting, without any of the careful budgeting that made each item feel genuinely earned. Back then, furnishing a home was itself a kind of practice in patience, a slow apprenticeship in building a life together, one careful purchase at a time. By the end of the first year, the apartment is far from grand, still sparse in places, still missing pieces you have not yet been able to afford, but it is unmistakably yours, filled with objects that each carry their own small history, their own small story of saving or receiving or choosing together. You sit in the armchair some evenings, lamp glowing warmly beside you, rug soft beneath your feet, and think that this slow, patient accumulation has given the apartment something a fully furnished house never could. A sense that every single object in the room was chosen or earned or given with real intention, and that the whole space, imperfect and mismatched as it is, was built entirely by the two of you. The roast is slightly overdone and the potatoes a touch underseasoned, but you set the table anyway with the good napkins, lighting a single candle because it feels like the occasion calls for it. Your husband says it is wonderful, and you both know it is not quite true, and somehow that makes the evening better, not worse. The kitchen had been warm all afternoon, filled with the smell of roasting meat, and the particular anxious energy of someone attempting something important for the very first time, without her mother standing nearby to correct each step. You'd followed the recipe carefully, copied in your own handwriting from a conversation over the telephone, but somewhere between checking the roast and peeling potatoes, timing had slipped just slightly, enough that the meat came out a touch drier than intended, the potatoes a little blander than you had hoped. Still you set the table with real care, smoothing the good tablecloth, folding the good napkins into careful triangles, the way you had seen done at your own mother's table growing up. You light a single candle in the centre, though there is no particular occasion beyond this simply being your first Sunday dinner cooked entirely on your own, and something about the small flame flickering against the early evening light makes the modest meal feel like a genuine celebration rather than an ordinary Sunday supper. He comes to the table freshly washed from an afternoon spent fixing a loose hinge somewhere in the building, sleeves still slightly rolled, and sits down with an expression of genuine anticipation that makes your stomach tighten slightly with nerves. You watch him take the first bite, watch the small pause before he speaks, and when he finally says it is wonderful, his voice carries just enough hesitation that you both know it is not entirely true. But rather than feeling disappointed, you find yourself laughing quietly, and he laughs too, admitting after a moment that the potatoes could perhaps use a bit more salt, that the roast is maybe cooked just slightly longer than ideal. There is no sting in the admission, only a kind of shared tenderness, both of you recognizing this small, imperfect meal for exactly what it is, a genuine, earnest first attempt, made with care even if not yet made with skill. You reach for the salt together, seasoning your own plates a little more generously, and the conversation drifts easily from there, away from the meal itself and toward the small events of your separate days, his hinge repair, your morning spent practicing the recipe, the neighbour 2 doors down who apparently argued loudly with her husband about curtains again. The imperfect dinner becomes almost incidental to the real substance of the evening, which is simply this: 2 people sitting together at a table they chose, eating a meal one of them prepared with real effort, talking easily about nothing in particular. The candle burns lower as the meal continues, its light softening the room, casting gentle shadows against the walls you painted together only weeks before. Outside, the evening settles into the particular quiet of a Sunday. No radio playing, no errands left to run, only the 2 of you and the slowly dwindling meal between you. When the plates are finally empty, you sit a while longer before clearing them, neither in any hurry to end the evening. He reaches for your hand across the table, thanks you again, more sincerely this time, for the effort even if the execution was not quite perfect, and you feel something settle warmly in your chest, a recognition that this, exactly this, imperfect food made with genuine care, honest laughter over small mistakes, quiet conversation by candlelight, is precisely what the beginning of a marriage is meant to feel like. Years from now, the roast will come out perfectly, the potatoes seasoned exactly right, but you suspect you will still remember this particular evening most fondly, Not because the meal was good, but because it was the first time you tried together to build something small and imperfect and entirely your own. Both of your mothers stopped by within the same week, each one quietly rearranging a shelf or offering an opinion on the curtains, and you learn quickly how to nod, thank them, and then put things back exactly where you had them once they leave. Your mother arrives first on a Tuesday afternoon, gloves still on as she steps through the door, eyes already sweeping the small living room with the practiced assessment of someone evaluating a household for the first time. She admires the rug, questions the placement of the armchair, and within minutes has quietly shifted the small side table 2 inches to the left, insisting it catches better light there, though you privately suspect it looked perfectly fine where it was. She moves through the kitchen next, opening cabinets with the easy familiarity of someone who raised you, and therefore feels entitled to know exactly where everything belongs. She rearranges the spice rack, alphabetizing what had previously been organized by frequency of use, and comments gently, though not unkindly, that a wife should always know exactly where the paprika is without having to think twice. You nod, thank her for the advice, and resolve privately to put the spices back the moment she leaves. His mother arrives just 2 days later, and though the visit unfolds differently in its specifics, the underlying rhythm feels strikingly similar. She admires the curtains you sewed with your own mother's help, then gently suggests they might hang better with a slightly heavier lining, offering to bring over fabric from her own sewing basket the following week. She examines the roast pan still drying by the sink and offers, with the warmest of intentions, an entirely different method for achieving a better sear, one that contradicts almost everything your own mother taught you. You listen to both women with genuine patience, recognizing that these small interventions, however unnecessary, come from a place of real love, each mother eager to see her child settled comfortably, eager to feel some continued sense of usefulness even as her role shifts from raising you to simply supporting you. There is something almost sweet in watching each of them move through your rooms, offering advice neither of you ask for but both of you receive graciously. After each visit, you find yourself quietly restoring things to their original arrangement, sliding the side table back those 2 inches, reorganizing the spice rack by frequency rather than alphabet, and there is a small private satisfaction in these tiny reversals, evidence that this apartment, however loved by your mothers, ultimately belongs to you and your husband alone to arrange as you see fit. You and he laugh about it together in the evenings, comparing notes on which specific pieces of advice each mother offered, finding gentle humour in how similarly protective and opinionated both women are despite having never discussed the matter between themselves. It becomes, in its own way, one of the small bonding rituals of these early months, the shared experience of navigating 2 well-meaning mothers who each still consider their own household wisdom the definitive standard. There is something tender beneath the mild exasperation, though, a recognition that these visits, however inconvenient, are simply another form of love. 2 women who spent decades caring for their children now finding new, slightly awkward ways to continue caring, even from a small distance. You suspect that someday you too will find yourself standing in some future daughter or son's kitchen, quietly reorganizing a shelf, unable to resist the urge to help even when help is not strictly required. For now, though, you simply nod, thank them, walk them to the door with warm goodbyes, and then quietly restore your small apartment back to exactly the arrangement you and your husband prefer. A gentle, ongoing negotiation between generations, conducted almost entirely through the rearrangement of side tables and spice racks. Every Friday evening, the household ledger comes out, a modest notebook where grocery bills and rent and the occasional splurge get written down in careful columns. It becomes a small ritual, sitting together at the table, coffee cooling between you, working out what the week ahead can afford. The notebook itself is unremarkable. Purchased for only a few cents from the corner stationer, its cover a plain, faded blue, its pages ruled in careful columns you drew yourselves during the very first week of marriage. Each Friday, once the dinner dishes are cleared and the kitchen table wiped clean, the ledger comes out, along with a small tin box where the week's receipts have been collected, crumpled and creased from being carried in coat pockets throughout the week. You take turns with the actual writing. 1 week him, the next week you, carefully copying figures from receipts into the appropriate columns, groceries in one, rent in another, a small miscellaneous column for anything that does not fit neatly elsewhere. The process moves slowly at first, both of you still learning exactly how much things cost, still calibrating what counts as a reasonable expense and what counts as an unnecessary indulgence. There is something quietly intimate about this shared accounting, the way it requires genuine honesty between you, admitting to the occasional treat purchased on impulse, a chocolate bar eaten on the walk home, a magazine bought simply because the cover caught your eye. Neither of you judges the other too harshly for these small splurges, understanding instinctively that a household run entirely on discipline without any small joys would eventually feel unbearably grim. The coffee between you cools slowly as the columns fill, cups refilled once, sometimes twice, the conversation drifting occasionally away from numbers and into simply talking about the week just past, about small plans for the week ahead. The budget book becomes, in its own modest way, a kind of anchor for these Friday evenings, a reason to sit together at the table with no other distraction, simply working through the practical realities of building a life on a still modest income. Some weeks the totals come out favourably, a little left over after every column is accounted for, and you allow yourselves a small celebration, perhaps a slightly nicer cut of meat the following Sunday, or a matinee at the local theatre. Other weeks the numbers come out tighter, and you sit together working out where small economies might be found, deciding perhaps to walk rather than take the trolley for a few days, or to make do with what remains in the pantry rather than making another trip to the market. There is very little tension in these conversations, surprisingly, perhaps because the ritual itself, the shared act of sitting together each Friday, transforms what could easily become a source of stress into something closer to teamwork. You're not managing money separately and comparing notes afterward. You're managing it together, in real time, each decision made jointly, each small sacrifice or celebration shared equally between you. By the end of the evening, the ledger closed and returned to its drawer. There is a particular satisfaction in having faced the week's finances honestly and directly, no figures hidden, no expenses concealed, simply two people working together toward the same modest practical goals. It is the kind of quiet, unglamorous intimacy that rarely gets written about, and yet it feels, in these early months, like one of the truest foundations of the life you are building, proof that even the most ordinary tasks carefully shared can become a genuine expression of partnership. The apartment building's laundry room is in the basement, dim and a little musty, but you go down together most weeks, feeding coins into the machine and folding warm sheets while you talk about nothing in particular. It becomes one of the quiet places where conversation flows easiest. The stairwell leading down feels several degrees cooler than the apartment above, the air carrying a faint mineral smell of concrete and standing water, and the single bare bulb overhead casts everything in a soft yellow glow that somehow makes the small basement room feel cosy rather than dreary. Two machines sit against the far wall, both slightly outdated even for this era, their enamel chipped in places, but reliable enough once you learn the particular rhythm each one requires. You carry the laundry down together in a shared basket, taking turns with the weight of it, and there is something companionable in this simple division of labour, No discussion needed over who will carry what, the task simply splitting itself naturally between you. Coins are counted out carefully beforehand, kept in a small tin specifically for this purpose, and you feed them into the machine together, watching the drum begin its slow, rhythmic churning. While the machines work, you sit together on the old wooden bench pushed against the wall, and this becomes, almost without either of you planning it, one of the easiest places for conversation to unfold. Perhaps it is the enforced waiting, nothing else to do but sit and talk while the machines hum nearby. Or perhaps it is simply the plainness of the setting. No distractions, no chores demanding tension, only the two of you and 20 minutes of unstructured time. You talk about small things mostly, a funny exchange overheard at the market, a worry about next month's rent, a memory from childhood suddenly surfacing for no particular reason. Occasionally the conversation drifts somewhere more meaningful, a quiet confession about missing your own mother's kitchen, a small worry about whether you're managing this new life correctly, and these deeper moments seem to surface more easily here, in this dim, unremarkable basement, than almost anywhere else in the apartment above. When the wash finishes, you carry the damp bundles back upstairs together, hanging sheets and shirts on the small line strung across the kitchen, the fabric still warm and smelling faintly of soap and clean water. Folding happens on the kitchen table, the two of you working in a comfortable rhythm, corners matched, sheets folded into careful thirds, the simple domestic task somehow made pleasant by being shared rather than solitary. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a basket of tangled, dirty laundry transform gradually into neat, folded stacks, each piece smelling faintly of soap, each fold a small testament to order restored. You notice over these early weeks how naturally you have developed your own small system, him handling the heavier lifting, you managing the careful folding, neither of you having explicitly divided the labour this way, the division simply emerging through repetition. It is the kind of ordinary chore that could easily feel like drudgery, and yet somehow, done together, it becomes instead one of the small pleasures of the week, an excuse to sit quietly together with nothing demanding your attention beyond simple conversation and the rhythmic hum of the machine nearby. You suspect, even this early into the marriage, that these unremarkable moments, folding warm sheets together at the kitchen table, sitting on a wooden bench in a dim basement waiting for a wash cycle to finish, will eventually become some of the moments you remember most fondly, precisely because they required nothing of you except simply being present together. It is something small, a misunderstanding about whose turn it was to write the thank you notes from the wedding, but it feels enormous in the moment. The apartment falls silent for an evening, and then, slowly, over dishes washed side by side, the tension eases without either of you quite deciding to let it go. The disagreement begins innocently enough, a comment made in passing about the stack of unwritten thank you cards still sitting on the side table weeks after the wedding, each of you having assumed, without ever explicitly discussing it, that the other had taken responsibility for finishing them. What starts as a simple clarification quickly sharpens into something more pointed, both of you feeling suddenly, unreasonably certain that you are the one who has been carrying more of the burden in these early weeks of marriage. Voices do not rise particularly loud. This is not the kind of argument that echoes through the thin apartment walls, but something in the tone shifts, clipped and careful, each word chosen with slightly more precision than usual, the way people speak when they're trying very hard not to say something they might regret. He retreats to the small armchair with the newspaper he's already read twice. You busy yourself in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot that does not particularly need scrubbing, both of you occupying the same small apartment, while managing to feel entirely separate within it. The silence that follows is heavier than any silence you have experienced together so far, different from the comfortable quiet of a shared Sunday afternoon, thick instead with unspoken frustration, each of you privately rehearsing arguments you have no real intention of voicing aloud. You find yourself wondering, with a small flicker of genuine worry, whether this is simply what marriage sometimes looks like. Two people occupying the same rooms while feeling entirely disconnected from one another. Dinner that evening is quieter than usual. Conversation reduced to only what is strictly necessary. Please pass the salt. Is there more bread? Small transactional phrases standing in for the easy chatter that has filled most of your evenings until now. You both eat a little faster than usual, eager for the meal to end, though neither of you quite knows what comes after. It is the dishes, in the end, that begin to thaw things. You move toward the sink out of habit, and he follows, wordlessly picking up the dish towel, and for a while you work in silence, you washing, him drying, the familiar rhythm of the task requiring just enough coordination that the silence begins to feel less like tension and more like simple quiet. Somewhere between the second and third plate, he says something small, an offhand comment about the thank you cards. Not quite an apology, but close enough to one, and you find yourself softening slightly in response, offering your own small concession in return. Neither of you fully resolves the original disagreement, not in any formal sense. No clear decision reached about whose responsibility the cards truly were. Instead, the tension simply dissolves gradually, dish by dish, small comment by small comment, until by the time the last pot is dried and put away, you find yourselves standing close together at the counter, some of the earlier stiffness gone from both your shoulders. Later in bed, you lie a while in the dark before either of you speaks, and finally he reaches for your hand beneath the blanket, a small wordless gesture that carries more sincerity than any spoken apology might have. You squeeze his hand in return, and something in your chest loosens fully then, the last of the day's tension finally releasing. You think, drifting towards sleep, that this was perhaps an important thing to learn this early, that disagreements would happen, that silence would sometimes settle over the apartment, but that it need not be frightening, that even the heaviest quiet could soften again through nothing more dramatic than washing dishes side by side, learning slowly, patiently, how to find your way back to each other. Two people, one sink, one small mirror, and an endless negotiation over shelf space for razors and bobby pins. It takes longer than either of you expected to work out a rhythm, but eventually mornings settle into something almost choreographed. The bathroom itself is barely larger than a closet, tiled in small white squares that have yellowed slightly with age. The single mirror above the sink fogged permanently at the edges no matter how often it is wiped clean. In the first week you both attempt to use the space at once, elbows bumping, a razor knocked into the sink, a bobby pin sent skittering across the tile floor, and it becomes quickly apparent that some kind of order needs to be established before the mornings dissolve entirely into minor chaos. You begin tentatively to divide the small shelf above the sink, your things on the left, his on the right, though the division shifts more than once in the early weeks as you each discover what the other actually needs close at hand. His shaving brush and mug claim a permanent spot nearest the faucet, since he uses it every morning without fail, while your small collection of bobby pins and a single jar of cold cream settle into the corner nearest the window, where the light is slightly better for pinning curls into place. The mirror becomes its own small point of negotiation, neither of you quite willing to admit how much time you actually need in front of it. Him arguing that shaving requires careful attention, you insisting that hair cannot simply be left to its own devices before a day out in public. Slowly, without any formal discussion, you settle into an order. Him first, quick and efficient, finished within minutes, followed by you, taking your time with pins and powder while he dresses in the next room. There are mornings when the rhythm falters, when he oversleeps and rushes in just as you're finishing, both of you crowded awkwardly around the small sink, sharing the mirror in halves, your reflection cut off at the shoulder by his elbow. These mornings produce their own particular kind of laughter, the absurdity of two grown adults attempting to fit themselves into a space meant comfortably for one, and somehow the inconvenience becomes, over time, less an irritation and more simply another small piece of shared history. You learn small things about each other in this cramped, intimate space that you might never have learned elsewhere. The particular face he makes while shaving, concentrated and slightly comic. The hum you make under your breath while pinning curls, entirely unaware you're doing it until he points it out one morning with a quiet, affectionate laugh. The bathroom, small and unglamorous as it is, becomes one of the places where the ordinary intimacy of marriage reveals itself most plainly. Two people learning the small mechanics of sharing space neither was designed to share. By the second month, the choreography has settled into something almost effortless. Towels hung in their designated places, razor and cold cream coexisting peacefully on the narrow shelf, the morning rhythm of who goes first and who lingers longer requiring no further discussion at all. It is the kind of quiet domestic harmony that develops without ceremony, built simply through repetition and small accommodations, until one day you notice, almost with surprise, that the cramped little bathroom no longer feels cramped at all, only familiar, only yours. You invite another young couple from down the hall for dinner, and the entire day beforehand is spent scrubbing floors, ironing napkins, and rehearsing what to say if the roast does not turn out right. When they finally arrive, laughing and bringing a bottle of something sweet, the nerves melt into something closer to joy. The morning begins early. Well before either of you would normally rise on a weekend, both of you move in through the apartment with a nervous energy neither quite admits aloud. You sweep the floor twice, though it was already clean from the day before, and iron the good napkins with unusual care, smoothing each crease as though the evening's success depends entirely on perfectly pressed linen. He moves furniture slightly, angling the armchair a few inches, insisting it makes the small living room feel more welcoming, though you suspect he simply needs something to occupy his hands. In the kitchen, you rehearse under your breath what you will say if the roast comes out dry again. Small phrases of graceful deflection prepared in advance, just in case. The nervousness feels slightly disproportionate to the occasion. This is only dinner with the young couple from down the hall, people you have already exchanged pleasant greetings with in the hallway a dozen times, and yet hosting your very first guests as a married couple carries its own particular weight. A sense that this evening is somehow a small test of the household you're building together. By late afternoon, the roast is in the oven, the table set with the good dishes, the single candle from your first Sunday dinner brought out again for the occasion. You check your reflection more than once in the small bathroom mirror, smoothing your hair, adjusting your dress, while he straightens his tie for what must be the fourth time, both of you circling the apartment in a nervous, restless loop, until finally, right on time, there is a knock at the door. The young couple arrives laughing already, mid-conversation about something that happened on their walkover, and the wife holds out a bottle of something sweet and slightly fizzy, insisting it seemed like the right thing to bring for an occasion like this. Within minutes, the careful nervousness of the afternoon dissolves entirely, replaced by easy conversation and shared laughter, the four of you settling into the small living room as though you have done this dozens of times before, rather than for the very first time. Dinner unfolds more smoothly than either of you expected, the roast turning out better than the rehearsed apologies had prepared for, and even if it had not, you suspect the evening would have gone just as warmly, the food itself somehow becoming secondary to the pleasure of simply having people in your home, filling the small rooms with conversation and laughter for the first time since you moved in. By the time the evening winds down, dishes cleared, the sweet bottle mostly emptied between the four of you, there is a comfortable looseness in the apartment that was not there earlier in the day, evidence that the rooms have been properly christened now, no longer simply a space where the two of you live quietly, but a home capable of holding friendship, laughter, and the particular warmth of a shared meal. Long after the couple has said their good nights and returned down the hall to their own apartment, you and your husband sit together amid the remnants of the evening, feeling, for the first time, that you have genuinely hosted, genuinely entertained, genuinely become the kind of household capable of welcoming others in. He leaves before 7 most mornings, and the apartment feels different in his absence, quieter, slower. You learn the exact sound of his key in the lock each evening, and it becomes, without either of you saying so, the signal that the day is finally complete. The mornings settle quickly into their own particular rhythm, the alarm sounding while the sky outside is still grey, him rising quietly in the dark to dress while you drift in and out of sleep, aware of his movements without fully waking. By the time you rise properly, he is usually gone already, his side of the bed cool, a faint impression left in the pillow, the only real evidence that he was ever there at all beyond the empty coffee cup rinsed and set neatly in the drying rack. The apartment feels different once he leaves. Not unpleasant exactly, but quieter in a way that takes some adjustment. The small rooms suddenly holding only your own footsteps, your own small sounds moving through spaces that only an hour before held two people's overlapping routines. You learn to fill these hours with your own rhythm, tidying, preparing for the evening meal, occasionally sitting simply with a cup of coffee by the window, watching the street below slowly wake up without you. The day stretches longer than you expect in these early weeks, and you find yourself more than once glancing at the small clock on the shelf, calculating how many hours remain before his return. It is not loneliness exactly, more a kind of anticipatory quiet, the apartment holding its breath slightly until the household is complete again. You come to know the specific sound of his key in the lock with a precision that surprises you, distinct from any other tenant's key in the building, a particular rhythm to how he turns it. A slight pause before the door swings open. The moment you hear it, something in your chest loosens, the day finally reaching its intended shape, and you find yourself moving toward the door almost without deciding to, eager simply to see his face again after the long stretch of hours apart. Some evenings he arrives tired, shoulders slightly stooped from a long day, and you learn to read these moods quickly, offering quiet company rather than immediate conversation, letting him settle into the armchair with the newspaper before drawing him gently into talk about his day. Other evenings he arrives energized, full of small stories from work, an amusing exchange with a colleague, a minor frustration with a supervisor, and these evenings unfold easily, conversation carrying you both straight through dinner and into the quiet hours afterward. You begin to understand over these early weeks that his work, though separate from your daily life at home, still shapes the household in its own quiet way, dictating the rhythm of your mornings, the timing of your evenings, the particular quality of quiet that settles over the apartment during the long stretch of hours he is away. It becomes, without either of you discussing it directly, simply the shape of your shared life, his departure and return marking the natural boundaries of each day, the sound of his key in the lock each evening remaining, even months later, one of the small, reliable comforts you have come to depend on. After months of careful saving, you finally buy something substantial together, perhaps a proper dining set or a used ice box to replace the one that barely keeps things cold. Signing the receipt together feels strangely official, like another small vow. The decision itself takes weeks to reach, Evenings spent poring over the budget book, calculating whether this month or perhaps next month might finally allow for the purchase you have both been quietly wanting since the very first week in the apartment. The old icebox has been failing steadily, milk turning slightly sour a day earlier than it should, butter softening too quickly even in cooler weather, and you have both grown weary of the small daily inconvenience of food spoiling faster than it ought to. When the savings finally reach the necessary amount, there is a small private celebration simply in the arithmetic of it, both of you recalculating the figures twice to be certain, allowing yourselves a moment of genuine pride at having managed, through weeks of careful economy, to save enough for something substantial. The trip to the shop itself carries an unexpected formality. Both of you dress slightly more carefully than the errand strictly requires, as though the occasion deserves a certain ceremony. The shop is larger than the corner market, rows of second-hand furniture and appliances arranged with careful pricing tags, and you move through the aisles together, testing drawers, checking hinges, comparing two similar iceboxes with the seriousness of people making a decision far larger than its actual size might suggest. The salesman, sensing perhaps the genuine importance of the moment for you both, takes his time explaining the mechanics of each option, and you listen carefully, nodding, exchanging small glances with your husband as you narrow the choice down together. When you finally settle on one, sturdy, only slightly worn, the price falling just within what you have saved, there is a genuine thrill in watching the salesman write up the receipt, the numbers finally becoming real rather than simply figures discussed over the budget book each Friday. Signing your names together at the bottom of the paper feels, in that moment, unexpectedly significant. Another small official act binding you together, another small piece of evidence that you are building this life deliberately, decision by decision, together. The delivery arrives 2 days later, carried up the narrow stairwell by two sweating young men who set it carefully into its designated corner of the kitchen, and you both stand admiring it for a long moment afterward, this solid, practical object that will now quietly serve your household for years to come. There is something deeply satisfying in the weight and permanence of it, evidence that your small household is capable of more than simply scraping by, capable of genuine, if modest, growth. That evening, you fill the new icebox carefully, milk and butter and a small piece of cheese arranged on its shelves, and you close the door with a quiet, satisfied click, both of you standing together in the kitchen admiring this small but meaningful addition to your shared life. It is not a grand purchase by any outside measure, simply a second-hand icebox bought after months of careful saving. But within the quiet economy of your first year together, it feels like something close to an accomplishment, proof that patience and partnership can, slowly, steadily, build something real. A loose cabinet hinge sends you both to the hardware store on a Saturday morning, and you spend far longer than necessary wandering the aisles, breathing in the smell of sawdust and machine oil, picking out things you did not know you needed. The errand begins simply enough, a single loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet that has been squeaking for weeks, finally irritating enough that you decide a Saturday morning trip to the hardware store is warranted. The walk there is unhurried, the morning still cool, and you find yourselves in no particular rush, content simply to walk together with nowhere urgent to be. The store itself greets you with its particular smell the moment you step through the door, sawdust and machine oil and something faintly metallic underneath, a smell that seems to belong entirely to this kind of establishment and nowhere else. Rows of neatly organized drawers line one wall, each labelled in small, careful handwriting, screws and nails and hinges sorted by size, while the opposite wall holds larger tools, hammers and saws hanging in careful rows, catching the light from the front window. You locate the correct hinge quickly enough, a simple matter of comparing the old one against the small selection available, but neither of you seems eager to leave once the actual errand is complete. He wanders toward the tool wall, examining a small handsaw with the kind of interest that suggests he is already imagining some future project, perhaps a shelf, perhaps a small repair to the wobbling kitchen table, though nothing specific has actually been planned. You drift toward a display of small household items near the front, a set of drawer pulls in a simple brass finish, a package of felt pads meant to protect the floor from scraping furniture legs, and you find yourself picking up items you had not realized you needed until this exact moment. A better broom, a small oil can for squeaking hinges throughout the apartment, a package of sandpaper that seems, suddenly, essential. The shopkeeper, an older man who seems to know most of his regular customers by name, offers advice freely when asked, suggesting a slightly different hinge than the one you had originally selected, insisting it will hold up better over time despite costing only slightly more. You accept his recommendation gratefully, appreciating the easy expertise he offers without any hint of condescension, and add a few more small items to your growing basket almost without noticing. By the time you finally approach the counter to pay, the simple errand for a single hinge has expanded into a small collection of items neither of you anticipated needing when you left the apartment that morning. There is something genuinely pleasant in this kind of unhurried wandering. The particular quiet satisfaction of a Saturday morning with no other obligations, simply the two of you moving slowly through aisles of practical, unglamorous objects, discovering small necessities you did not know you lacked. The walk home feels lighter somehow, a small paper sack swinging between you, containing the modest treasures of the morning, and you find yourselves already discussing where the felt pads should go, which chair legs need them most urgently. The conversation easy and practical in a way that feels distinctly like the ordinary texture of a life being built together, one small hardware store errand at a time. When the weather allows, you spend Sunday afternoons on the small shared porch outside your apartment, listening to a neighbour's radio drift through an open window, saying very little, simply enjoying the shared stillness of having nowhere else to be. The porch itself is narrow, shared with the apartment next door. Two simple wooden chairs positioned close enough together that your elbows nearly touch when you both settle into them after the midday meal. The wood beneath your feet has weathered to a soft grey, worn smooth in places by years of previous tenants, who presumably enjoyed these same quiet Sunday afternoons long before you arrived. Most Sundays, once the dishes from the noon meal are cleared and the small kitchen restored to order, you find yourselves drawn out here without much discussion, simply drifting toward the porch as though pulled by the same quiet instinct. The afternoon sun slants warmly across the boards, and somewhere nearby, through an open window 2 floors up, a neighbour's radio plays softly, music and occasional voices drifting down to mingle with the ordinary sounds of the street below. Conversation on these afternoons tends to be sparse, not from any lack of things to say, but simply because the quiet itself feels too pleasant to disturb with unnecessary chatter. You might comment occasionally on a passer-by, a child chasing a hoop down the sidewalk, a delivery truck idling at the corner, but mostly you sit together in comfortable silence, watching the street's slow Sunday rhythm unfold below you. He often brings the newspaper out with him, though he rarely makes much progress through it. The pages resting mostly unread on his lap while his attention drifts instead toward the street, toward you, toward the general pleasant idleness of the afternoon. You bring whatever small mending or handwork needs doing that week, though your hands, too, tend to still after a while, needle and thread forgotten in your lap as the afternoon's quiet settles more deeply over you both. The radio music drifting down from above becomes, over these early months, a kind of soundtrack to your Sunday afternoons, familiar songs you begin to recognize, certain announcers whose voices you come to know without ever having met them. Sometimes he hums along under his breath, barely aware he is doing it, and you find yourself smiling quietly at the small, unconscious habit, another tiny detail added to the growing collection of things you know about him now. These afternoons carry no particular agenda, no task requiring completion, no errand demanding attention, simply two people sitting together in a slanted sunlight, listening to distant music, watching the street's unhurried Sunday rhythm. It is the kind of quiet that is harder to find now, unstructured time with no purpose beyond simply being present together, and you suspect, even in these early months, that these porch afternoons will remain. Years from now, among the gentlest memories of this first year, precious not for anything remarkable that happened during them, but for the simple, sufficient pleasure of having nowhere else to be. Deciding whose family to visit for the holiday becomes its own delicate negotiation, full of gentle compromise and a little guilt on both sides. In the end, you split the day between both houses, arriving home exhausted but strangely closer for having navigated it together. The question arises weeks before the actual holiday, raised carefully over dinner one evening, both of you aware that this first decision will likely set a pattern for years of holidays to come. Your mother has already mentioned more than once how much she is looking forward to having you both at her table, while his mother has made similarly clear, in her own quieter way, that she expects the same consideration. You discuss the matter several times over the following days, weighing travel time against family expectations, trying to find some arrangement that avoids disappointing either household too severely. There is a particular delicacy required in these conversations, neither of you wanting to seem as though you favour one family over the other, both of you carrying a quiet inherited sense of obligation toward your own parents that makes any decision feel weighted with more significance than a single day's schedule probably deserves. Eventually you settle on splitting the day itself, an early meal at your family's table followed by an afternoon and evening spent at his, a plan that satisfies neither household entirely but seems, after much discussion, like the fairest available compromise. Informing your own mother of this arrangement requires careful diplomacy, a phone call in which you emphasize how much you are looking forward to the morning together, while gently explaining the necessity of the afternoon departure. The day itself unfolds in a whirlwind of travel and transition, an early start to arrive at your family's home in time for the late morning meal, warm greetings and familiar dishes, your mother fussing gently over both of you, in a manner that feels comforting despite the underlying awareness that you cannot linger as long as she might wish. By early afternoon, you are saying your goodbyes, promising to return soon, climbing into a borrowed car or catching a trolley across town toward his family's home. His mother's table offers its own warm welcome, different dishes, different traditions, a slightly different rhythm to the conversation and gathering, and you find yourself adjusting quickly, grateful for the months you have already spent learning the particular habits and preferences of his family during earlier visits. The afternoon stretches into evening, another full meal, another round of warm conversation, and by the time you finally make your goodbyes and begin the tired journey back to your own small apartment, exhaustion has settled deeply into both your shoulders. The apartment, when you finally arrive, feels quiet and small after the fullness of two family gatherings, but there is a particular comfort in its familiarity, your own space, your own bed, the accumulated warmth of the day settling into something closer to contentment despite the exhaustion. You sit together for a while before undressing for bed, comparing notes on the day, laughing quietly over small moments from each gathering, and there is a genuine closeness in this shared recounting, evidence that navigating the delicate diplomacy of two families together has, if anything, drawn the two of you closer rather than straining the day with unnecessary tension. You fall asleep that night more tired than you have been in weeks, but also aware of a small, quiet satisfaction, the recognition that you have successfully navigated your first holiday as a married couple. Imperfectly, perhaps, exhausting certainly, but together, and that this shared navigation, however tiring, has become its own small proof of partnership. You spend an entire evening on the phone with his mother, copying down a recipe in careful shorthand, determined to get it just right. When you finally serve it and he takes the first bite in stunned silence, the moment feels like its own small victory. The idea comes to you almost impulsively, a desire to surprise him with something familiar and beloved rather than another new recipe you're both still learning to navigate together. You know only vaguely that his favourite meal growing up involved a particular kind of stew his mother made, seasoned in a way neither you nor any cookbook seems quite able to replicate, and so you decide, after some hesitation, to simply telephone her directly and ask. The conversation stretches longer than expected, his mother clearly delighted at the request, walking you slowly through each step while you copy the instructions down in careful shorthand, asking her to repeat certain measurements twice to be certain you have them exactly right. She offers small asides throughout, memories of cooking the same dish for him as a child, insisting he always requested it on his birthday, information you file away carefully alongside the recipe itself. You spend the following evening in the kitchen with unusual concentration, the handwritten instructions propped against the sugar tin, following each step with careful attention, tasting and adjusting as you go, second-guessing yourself more than once over whether the seasoning matches what his mother described. The apartment fills slowly with a smell that is entirely new to your own cooking so far, something warm and slightly unfamiliar, evidence that you are attempting, for the first time, to recreate a piece of his childhood rather than simply feeding him something of your own invention. When he arrives home that evening, he notices the smell immediately, pausing in the doorway with an expression of genuine surprise, asking what exactly you're making before you can even explain. You simply gesture him toward the table, saying nothing, wanting the dish itself to reveal what you've attempted rather than announcing it beforehand and risking disappointment if the execution falls short of his memory. He takes the first bite slowly and for a moment says nothing at all, his expression unreadable enough that your stomach tightens slightly with nerves, wondering if you have somehow gotten the recipe wrong despite your careful notes. Then, finally, he looks up, something soft and slightly amazed in his expression, and asks quietly how you managed to make this exact dish, this precise flavour he's not tasted since leaving his mother's table. You admit, laughing slightly with relief, that you called his mother directly, and he shakes his head slowly, genuinely moved by the effort, reaching across the table for your hand before returning immediately to his plate, eating with a kind of enthusiasm that confirms, more clearly than any words could, how successfully you have managed to recreate something he clearly treasures. The rest of the meal passes with him occasionally pausing simply to comment again on how accurately the flavour matches his memory, and you find yourself glowing quietly with a particular satisfaction of having given him something genuinely meaningful. Not simply a meal, but a small piece of his own history, carefully preserved and returned to him through your own effort. It becomes, from that evening forward, a dish you make regularly, and each time, watching him take the first bite, you feel again that same small victory. The quiet proof that loving someone well sometimes means simply calling their mother and taking careful notes. An older couple lives just beyond your thin apartment wall, and slowly you come to recognize the particular creak of their evening routine, the smell of their Sunday cooking drifting beneath the door. Without ever having a real conversation, their presence becomes oddly comforting. The walls between apartments are thin enough that certain sounds travel easily, and within the first few weeks you begin to recognize the particular rhythm of your neighbors' evenings without ever having exchanged more than a polite nod in the hallway. There is the creak of a specific floorboard just before 8 each evening, followed reliably by the low murmur of a radio program, voices too muffled to make out clearly but familiar enough in their cadence that you could likely identify the program simply from the pattern of dialogue and pauses. On Sunday afternoons, the smell of their cooking drifts beneath your shared door with a particular consistency, something rich and slow simmered, filling your own small kitchen with a second-hand aroma that somehow makes your apartment feel warmer even before you have started your own meal. You have never actually asked what they prepare each week, content instead to simply enjoy the mystery of it, guessing occasionally between yourselves what dish might produce such a specific, comforting smell. You piece together small details about their lives without ever directly asking. The elderly wife's slow, careful footsteps suggesting some difficulty walking. The husband's occasional cough through the wall each morning around the same time, evidence of some minor ongoing ailment neither of you feels entitled to inquire about directly. There is something almost tender in this indirect knowledge, an intimacy built entirely through proximity rather than actual conversation. Two households living so closely that certain private rhythms become, unavoidably, shared knowledge. Occasionally you pass them in the hallway or on the stairs, exchanging brief, warm greetings, comments about the weather, small pleasantries that never develop into anything more substantial. And yet these brief exchanges carry a genuine warmth, evidence of goodwill between neighbours who share walls but not yet friendship. The husband tips his hat each time he passes you on the stairs, an old-fashioned courtesy that always makes you smile slightly, while his wife offers a soft, genuine smile of her own, the kind that suggests she remembers clearly what it felt like to be newly married in a small apartment much like this one. There is comfort, you find, in simply knowing they are there. This older couple whose lives run parallel to your own just beyond a thin wall, their evening radio program becoming almost a companion sound to your own quiet evenings, their Sunday cooking smell becoming a kind of unspoken marker of the week's rhythm. You imagine sometimes what their own first year of marriage might have looked like, decades ago now, whether they too sat together on a similar porch, argued over similarly small things, slowly built the same kind of quiet, accumulated intimacy you're only now beginning to construct for yourselves. It is a strange, gentle kind of companionship, built entirely from proximity and small, indirect observations rather than actual friendship. And yet it adds something genuinely warm to the texture of your days, the sense that you're not entirely alone in this building, that just beyond the thin wall separating your lives, another household moves through its own version of ordinary domestic rhythm, quietly, reliably, comfortingly present. Some evenings, after the dishes are done, you spread out clippings from magazines, pictures of small houses with front lawns and covered porches, imagining a future that still feels a little out of reach but not impossible. The clippings accumulate slowly over these early months, torn carefully from magazines borrowed from the corner drugstore or passed along by friends, each one depicting some small variation of the same basic dream. A modest house with its own front lawn, perhaps a covered porch, certainly more space than the 2 rooms you currently occupy. You keep them in a small folder tucked into the desk drawer, and some evenings, once the dishes are cleared and the kitchen restored to order, you spread them out across the table together, studying each image with the serious attention of people planning something genuinely significant. He tends to favour the pictures with a small workshop or garage attached, already imagining tools organised along the walls, small projects undertaken on quiet weekends, while you find yourself drawn more toward the kitchens, studying the placement of windows, imagining where a proper table might sit, where morning light might fall across the counter. Neither preference is discussed as more important than the other, simply two different visions slowly merging into something you imagine eventually might become an actual shared plan. You calculate some evenings roughly how many years such a purchase might require at your current rate of saving, the numbers still discouraging in these early months, though neither of you allows the distance to feel entirely hopeless. There is something sustaining in simply having the clippings, tangible evidence of a future you're both quietly working toward, even if that future remains for now comfortably distant. Sometimes the conversation drifts into specifics that feel almost like play, debating what colour the front door might be, whether a garden should be attempted despite neither of you having much experience growing anything, whether the porch should be wide enough for 2 chairs or perhaps even 3, in case someday your small household grows larger than just the 2 of you. These conversations carry a particular lightness, imagination allowed to wander freely without the practical constraints that govern most of your other household decisions. The apartment you currently occupy, small and imperfect as it sometimes feels, becomes in these moments simply a beginning rather than a limitation, a necessary first chapter in a story you're both actively writing towards something larger. You find a particular comfort in this, the recognition that contentment with your current circumstances and genuine ambition for something more are not contradictory, that you can love this small apartment deeply while still, quite reasonably, wanting eventually to grow beyond it. By the time you finally gather the clippings back into their folder each evening, tucking them away for another week, there is usually a quiet, settled feeling between you, the shared dreaming itself having accomplished something meaningful regardless of how distant the actual house remains. It is the kind of hope that feels sustainable precisely because it is shared. 2 people imagining a future together, patient enough to save carefully toward it, content enough to wait, and quietly certain, even this early, that whatever house eventually holds you both will feel, from the very first day, entirely and unmistakably like home. A whole Saturday is lost to steady rain, and instead of feeling wasted, the day becomes something soft and unhurried, spent reading side by side, listening to the radio, watching water streak down the window pane. The rain begins sometime before dawn, a steady, patient sound against the roof that greets you both the moment you wake, and there is an immediate mutual understanding that today will not be a day for errands or plans, only for the slow, unhurried pleasure of staying indoors. You linger longer than usual over breakfast, coffee refilled twice, neither of you in any rush to rise from the table, the grey light outside the window making the small kitchen feel especially warm and enclosed by comparison. By mid-morning, you have both settled into the small living room, him in the armchair with a book borrowed from the library weeks ago and only now finally opened. You curled into the corner of the second-hand sofa with a magazine, feet tucked beneath you against the slight chill that has crept into the apartment along with the rain. The radio hums low in the background, a program neither of you follows closely, simply pleasant noise to accompany the steady percussion of rain against the window pane. You find yourself glancing up periodically, watching rivulets of water trace uneven paths down the glass, distorting the grey shapes of the buildings across the street into something soft and impressionistic. There is a particular comfort in watching weather from safely inside, the small apartment feeling especially secure against the steady downpour, walls holding warmth, while the world beyond the window turns increasingly wet and grey. Conversation drifts occasionally between long stretches of comfortable silence, a comment about something read, a small laugh shared over an amusing line from the radio program, but mostly you simply exist together in easy quiet, each absorbed in your own small task while remaining fully aware of the other's presence nearby. He reaches over at one point, without looking up from his book, to rest a hand briefly on your knee, a small, wordless gesture that requires no response beyond the quiet warmth it produces. By early afternoon, the rain shows no sign of easing, and you decide together, with a kind of mutual, unspoken agreement, to make a simple lunch from whatever remains in the pantry, rather than venture out into the weather. The meal is modest, bread and cheese and the last of yesterday's soup warmed carefully on the stove, but eaten together at the small table with rain still drumming steadily against the window, it feels entirely satisfying, requiring nothing more elaborate to feel complete. The afternoon continues in much the same unhurried rhythm as the morning. Books eventually set aside in favour of simply talking, memories surfacing unprompted, small hopes for the future mentioned almost in passing, the kind of meandering conversation that rarely happens on busier days when errands and obligations compete for attention. You realise, somewhere in the midst of this lazy afternoon, that you cannot remember the last time you spent so many consecutive hours simply existing, together with no particular task demanding completion. As evening approaches, the rain finally begins to soften, though neither of you moves immediately to acknowledge the change, both reluctant to break the day's particular spell of unhurried togetherness. When you finally do rise to prepare a simple dinner, there is a quiet satisfaction in having let an entire day pass this way, unproductive by any conventional measure, and yet somehow deeply restorative, evidence that some of the finest days require nothing more than rain against the window and the steady, comfortable presence of someone you love sitting quietly nearby. Whether to keep the radio on during dinner, how warm the apartment should be at night, which side of the bed belongs to whom, these small negotiations happen quietly and constantly, each one another thread woven into the shape of a shared life. You discover, within the first months, that marriage consists far less of grand decisions and far more of an endless accumulation of small ones, each requiring its own quiet negotiation, most settled so gently that neither of you fully registers the compromise being made. The radio during dinner becomes an early point of gentle difference, him preferring it on low for company, you preferring silence so conversation can flow more easily, and you settle eventually on a rhythm where it plays softly through the meal's beginning, then gets switched off once the real talking starts. The bedroom window becomes another small point of ongoing negotiation, him preferring it cracked even in cooler weather, insisting he sleeps better with fresh air moving through the room, you preferring it shut tight against the evening chill. You compromise by keeping a spare blanket folded at the foot of the bed specifically for nights when the window stays open, a small, practical solution that satisfies you both without requiring either to fully surrender the preference. Which side of the bed belongs to whom resolves itself almost accidentally in the very first week, based simply on which side happened to be nearer the door on moving day, and though neither of you ever formally decided this arrangement, it solidifies quickly into something neither would think to question. His side nearest the door, yours nearest the window, each of you developing small proprietary feelings about territory that was never actually claimed through discussion. Some negotiations require slightly more deliberate conversation. How much of the budget can reasonably go towards small luxuries each month? How often you might justify a matinee at the local theatre? Whether Sunday afternoons belong strictly to rest, or occasionally to errands that could not be completed during the week. These larger questions get worked out gradually over the shared ritual of the Friday budget book, each of you offering your own priorities, slowly finding the middle ground that satisfies both, without requiring either to feel shortchanged. There's a particular skill you both discover yourselves developing, almost without noticing, the ability to recognize which preferences matter deeply and which can be surrendered easily, when to hold firm and when a small concession costs nothing, but produces genuine goodwill in return. You learn that he cares little about which brand of coffee fills the tin, but feels strongly about how the towels get folded, while you find yourself indifferent to the placement of the armchair, but surprisingly particular about how early dinner gets served each evening. These small compromises rarely feel like sacrifice in any meaningful sense, more like the natural, ongoing calibration required whenever two separate lives merge into something shared. You begin to understand that a successful marriage is built less from perfectly matched preferences and more from a genuine willingness to notice what matters to the other person and to offer flexibility generously when it does not cost you much to bend. By the end of this first year, you find that most of these small negotiations no longer require conscious thought at all. The window cracked with a spare blanket ready, the radio switched off once dinner conversation begins, each of you moving through these small accommodations with an ease that suggests, more clearly than any single grand romantic gesture could, that you have genuinely learned to build a shared life together, one small compromise at a time. It happens without warning, somewhere around month 9, a quiet evening when nothing remarkable occurs, and yet for the first time the apartment feels less like a place you are staying and entirely like a place you belong. The evening itself carries no particular significance beforehand. An ordinary Tuesday following an unremarkable day, dinner prepared from familiar ingredients, dishes washed in the now practiced rhythm you both long ago settled into without discussion. You find yourself standing at the kitchen window afterward, drying your hands on the embroidered towel that has hung from the oven handle since your very first week here, watching the last light fade slowly over the rooftops across the street. Something in this small, unremarkable moment settles over you differently than it has before, a sudden, quiet recognition that you're not simply staying here temporarily while waiting for some more permanent future to begin, that this apartment, small and imperfect as it remains, has become genuinely, entirely your home. The realization arrives without fanfare, no dramatic shift in circumstance prompting it, simply the accumulated weight of 9 months of ordinary evenings finally settling into something that feels unmistakably permanent. You look around the small kitchen with new eyes, noticing details that have become so familiar you had stopped truly seeing them. The chip in the yellow cabinet you decided long ago to love rather than fix. The rug in the next room worn slightly at its edges from months of daily footsteps. The particular way evening light falls across the table at exactly this hour. None of these details are new, and yet tonight they strike you with a particular tenderness, evidence of a life genuinely lived here rather than simply endured while waiting for something better. He comes to stand beside you at the window, drawn perhaps by the quality of your silence, and you find yourself telling him, somewhat to your own surprise, about this sudden clarity, this recognition that the apartment has finally, fully become home rather than simply a temporary arrangement. He considers this for a moment, then admits quietly that he has felt something similar building for weeks now, unable to pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred, but certain, now that you mention it, that it has genuinely happened. You stand together a while longer, saying little else, simply absorbing this small, significant realization, watching the last of the evening light fade fully into darkness beyond the window. There is something deeply satisfying in recognizing this milestone together, even though neither of you could have predicted exactly when it might arrive. Evidence that home is built not through any single decisive moment, but through the slow, patient accumulation of countless ordinary evenings just like this one. Later, lying in bed together, you find yourself thinking back over the small history contained within these 2 rooms, the nervous first morning, the imperfect first dinner, the quiet argument resolved through dishes washed side by side, the rainy Saturday spent reading together, each small memory another thread in the fabric that has, apparently without your fully noticing, woven itself into something genuinely, permanently home. You drift towards sleep with a quiet contentment settling deeply into your chest, grateful for this ordinary Tuesday evening that somehow, unexpectedly, revealed something you suspect you will remember for the rest of your life together. On a quiet evening, you pull out the wedding photographs, still slightly stiff in their album, and look through them together, laughing at old expressions, remembering nerves and joy that already feel like they belong to slightly younger versions of yourselves. The album itself sits on the small bookshelf he built, its cover still smelling faintly of new leather, and you retrieve it almost on impulse one quiet evening, curious suddenly to revisit a day that already feels, strangely, like it belongs to some earlier, slightly different version of yourselves. You settle together on the sofa, the album balanced across both your laps, and begin turning through the stiff pages slowly, each photograph prompting its own small burst of memory and laughter. The very first photograph, taken before the ceremony, shows you standing nervously in your mother's living room, an expression on your face that you now recognize immediately as barely concealed panic, and you laugh softly at the memory of those final minutes beforehand, certain in that moment that you might forget your vows entirely, despite having practiced them dozens of times. He points out his own photograph from that same morning, straightening his tie with an expression of similar terror, and you both marvel now at how genuinely frightened you each were, despite having no real doubt whatsoever about the decision itself. The ceremony photographs bring their own quiet tenderness. The particular angle of light through the church windows, the slightly blurred motion of your father walking you down the aisle, captured just as he turned to whisper something you no longer entirely remember. You linger over the photograph of the actual vows being exchanged, both your expressions caught in a moment of genuine, unguarded emotion that the formal posed photographs taken afterward somehow failed to capture with quite the same honesty. The reception photographs produced the most laughter, an aunt caught mid-dance step with an expression of pure, undignified joy, a cousin who apparently spent most of the evening near the punch bowl, judging by his increasingly relaxed posture in each successive photograph. You remember details neither of you had thought about in months, the particular song played for your first dance, the small mishap when the cake nearly toppled before being rescued by a quick-handed caterer, the way your grandmother cried through nearly the entire ceremony, despite insisting beforehand that she would remain perfectly composed. There is something bitter-sweet in recognizing how young you both appear in these photographs taken barely a year ago, and yet already capturing versions of yourselves that feel subtly different from who you have since become. You have learned so much in these intervening months, how to budget together, how to argue and reconcile, how to build an entire shared life from countless small daily decisions, and the nervous, hopeful couple in these photographs seems, in retrospect, endearingly unaware of everything still ahead of them. By the time you close the album and set it carefully back on its shelf, there is a quiet fullness in the room, gratitude for the day itself, but also, more powerfully, gratitude for everything that has followed since, the accumulated texture of an entire first year built patiently atop the foundation that day represented. You sit together a while longer in comfortable silence, the wedding day itself already receding gently into memory, replaced by the deeper, quieter satisfaction of having spent nearly a full year proving that the promises made that day were genuine and worth every small effort required to keep them. As the first anniversary approaches, you find yourselves already speaking in the language of we without noticing when it started, and the small apartment that once felt unfamiliar now holds an entire year of quiet, ordinary, deeply meaningful history. You notice the shift first in small, unremarkable conversations. The easy way, both of you now say we without any conscious thought. We should visit your mother this weekend. We might finally afford new curtains next month. The pronoun arriving so naturally that neither of you registers when exactly it replaced the more tentative I and you of those very first weeks together. It strikes you, thinking back, that this quiet linguistic shift captures something larger than language alone. Evidence of two separate lives having genuinely merged into something now spoken of, thought of, lived as a single shared unit. The apartment itself has transformed alongside this shift. No longer the sparse, unfamiliar rooms you first walked into smelling of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, but a space now layered thoroughly with an entire year's accumulated history. The chipped yellow cabinet, the slightly mismatched furniture gathered piece by piece, the embroidered towel still hanging faithfully from the oven handle. Each object now carries its own small story, evidence of a home built deliberately, patiently, one ordinary decision at a time. You find yourself some evenings simply sitting quietly and taking inventory of everything this first year has actually contained. The nervous early mornings, the small arguments resolved through shared chores, the rainy Saturday spent reading side by side, the quiet, unexpected realization that this apartment had finally become genuinely home. None of these moments, taken individually, would seem remarkable enough to remember clearly years from now, and yet together they have built something you suspect you will treasure for the rest of your life. The quiet, unglamorous proof that love is constructed largely from ordinary Tuesdays rather than dramatic, memorable occasions. As the anniversary itself approaches, you find yourselves discussing, almost shyly, what the day might hold, neither particularly interested in anything elaborate, both instinctively drawn instead toward marking the occasion with something quiet and reflective. Perhaps a simple dinner at home, perhaps another evening spent reviewing the wedding photographs, grateful simply for the chance to acknowledge, together, how far you have come in this first year of ordinary accumulated life. You think, some quiet evenings, about the second year now stretching ahead, uncertain in its specific details but comfortingly familiar in its general shape. More Friday evenings with the budget book, more Sunday afternoons on the shared porch, more small negotiations over shelf space and radio volume, and which side of the bed belongs to whom. There is nothing frightening in this uncertainty, only a quiet, settled confidence that whatever the second year brings, you will navigate it together, using the same patient, accumulated wisdom this first year has slowly taught you both. As you drift towards sleep on the eve of your anniversary, the apartment settle quietly around you, filled now with an entire year's worth of small, treasured history. You find yourself grateful, simply and deeply, for this ordinary life you have built together, one imperfect dinner, one small compromise, one quiet Tuesday evening at a time. Whatever grand adventures the future might eventually hold, you suspect, drifting finally towards sleep, that you will always remember this particular year most fondly. The first year, the foundation, the quiet, patient beginning of everything that came after. It catches you off guard on an otherwise ordinary evening, folding a small stack of his shirts still warm from the line, when a wave of quiet gratitude rises up so suddenly that tears come before you even understand why, and you stand there in the kitchen simply letting them fall, surprised by how full a plain, unremarkable moment can feel. You had not been thinking of anything particularly significant beforehand, only the small mechanical rhythm of folding sleeve over sleeve, collar smoothed flat, the familiar smell of sun and starch still clinging faintly to the cotton. The radio hums low from the other room, some program you're only half listening to, and the late afternoon light slants gold across the kitchen floor in that particular way it does this time of year. Warm and low and unhurried. It is nothing in particular that triggers the feeling, only the sudden, overwhelming awareness of how ordinary this moment is and how deeply, unexpectedly grateful you are for its ordinariness. You think of the nervous bride from a year ago, uncertain whether she could manage a household, uncertain whether love could survive the daily friction of shared space, and you think of her now standing steady in this small kitchen, folding shirts with practiced hands, entirely at home in a life she once only imagined. The tears surprise you more than they trouble you, and you find yourself laughing softly even as they fall, wiping your cheek with the back of your wrist before returning to the folding, unwilling to let even happy tears interrupt the small domestic task at hand. You glance down at the shirt in your hands, one of his everyday ones, the collar slightly frayed from wear, and something about its ordinariness, its plainness, its evidence of a life actually lived rather than simply imagined, deepens the feeling rather than easing it. You think unexpectedly of your own mother, of some quiet afternoon years ago when you watched her fold your father's shirts in much the same way, never once considering at the time what feeling might have been moving through her during that ordinary task. You wonder now whether she too once stood at some kitchen counter, overcome without warning by gratitude for a life she had built quietly, patiently, one ordinary chore at a time, and the thought connects you suddenly to a lineage of women who came before you, folding shirts, keeping houses, building homes from nothing more dramatic than daily faithfulness. When he comes in a few minutes later, drawn perhaps by the particular quality of your silence, he pauses in the doorway, immediately concerned, asking gently what is wrong. Nothing is wrong, you tell him, and you mean it entirely, though the explanation that follows comes out halting and imperfect, an attempt to describe a feeling that resists easy language, something about gratitude, about how strange and lovely it is to simply be standing here, in this kitchen, folding his shirts, a year into a life you once could only imagine from the outside. He listens carefully, understanding perhaps more than your fumbling words actually convey, and crosses the room to fold you gently into an embrace, shirts still scattered across the table between you. You rest your head against his chest for a long moment, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat, and something in the simple physicality of the embrace, warm and solid and entirely unremarkable, only deepens the quiet emotion still moving through you. You stand together a long moment in the fading afternoon light, and he admits, quietly, that he has felt something similar more than once these past months, a sudden swell of feeling arriving without warning during some entirely unremarkable task, evidence perhaps that contentment this deep does not always announce itself gently, but sometimes arrives instead like a small wave, catching you by surprise before receding again into the ordinary rhythm of the day. He tells you, somewhat shyly, that it happened to him once while simply watching you sleep on an ordinary Sunday morning, no occasion prompting the feeling beyond the plain fact of your presence beside him. You find this small confession moving in its own quiet way, evidence that he too has been carrying these unexpected swells of gratitude without necessarily voicing them aloud, each of you privately overwhelmed at different moments by the same accumulated tenderness neither had fully anticipated when you first exchanged your vows. It occurs to you that perhaps this is simply what a full year of marriage does, builds up gratitude so gradually and so thoroughly that it eventually spills over unbidden, arriving not during some grand occasion, but during the plainest, most ordinary tasks imaginable. It is the kind of feeling that is harder to name now than it once was to simply feel, this quiet, overwhelming gratitude for an unremarkable life built entirely from small, patient choices. You return to the folding eventually, sleeves smoothed, collars straightened, the shirts finally stacked neatly into the drawer where they belong, and though the moment itself passes, its warmth lingers through the rest of the evening, colouring even the small, ordinary tasks that follow: dinner prepared, dishes washed, the radio switched off at its usual hour. Later, lying in bed together in the dark, you find yourself returning briefly to the feeling, turning it over quietly in your mind, grateful not only for the moment itself, but for the marriage that has made such a moment possible. A life steady and settled enough that gratitude can simply rise up unbidden on an ordinary Tuesday, unprompted by any occasion beyond the plain, sufficient fact of shared life continuing faithfully, one folded shirt at a time. You drift towards sleep with the quiet certainty that there will be other such moments ahead, small unexpected swells of feeling arriving without warning through all the ordinary years still to come. A reminder that happiness, the truest and most durable kind, often arrives disguised as nothing more remarkable than an ordinary Tuesday spent folding laundry beside someone you love. A slightly larger expense than either of you anticipated arrives one week, forcing an honest conversation about priorities that neither of you particularly enjoys, though the evening ends with a clearer understanding of what you each actually value. The expense itself is nothing dramatic, simply a repair needed on the old sewing machine passed down from your grandmother, more costly than either of you expected when the repairman finally quotes his price. Sitting together over the budget book that Friday evening, you both stare at the figure a moment longer than necessary, each quietly calculating what its inclusion might mean for the following weeks. The coffee between you growing cold as the silence stretches on slightly longer than usual. He suggests carefully that perhaps the machine could wait, that mending could be managed by hand a while longer until the household has recovered from a few other recent expenses. There is nothing unreasonable in the suggestion, spoken gently and without any real edge, and yet you feel a small flare of frustration rise despite yourself, the machine representing something more significant to you than its practical function alone, a connection to your grandmother, a small piece of continuity you're reluctant to set aside simply for the sake of convenient arithmetic. You try at first to explain this calmly, but your voice carries slightly more heat than you intend, and you notice him stiffen slightly in response, clearly surprised by the intensity of your reaction to what he had assumed was a straightforward practical matter. The conversation grows slightly tense, neither voice raised particularly loud, but an edge creeping into the exchange nonetheless, each of you feeling somewhat unheard by the other, the budget book sitting open and forgotten between you, while the actual disagreement takes on a life of its own. He explains with visible effort at patience that he is not dismissing the machine's importance to you, only trying to manage the practical reality of a tight month, the rent due in 10 days, the icebox repair from last month still not fully absorbed into the budget's usual rhythm. You explain, with equal effort, that some expenses carry weight beyond simple practicality, that certain things are worth stretching the budget to protect, that a machine passed down through 3 generations of women in your family deserves more consideration than a simple line item to be postponed at convenience. You sit in a brief, uncomfortable silence after this exchange, both of you aware that the disagreement, though small, touches on something slightly larger, the ongoing negotiation of how to weigh sentiment against practicality, how to honour both partners' priorities when they occasionally, unavoidably, conflict. You each retreat slightly into your own thoughts, him staring at the budget figures as though they might rearrange themselves into an easier answer, you staring instead at the old sewing machine itself, visible through the doorway into the next room, its worn wooden casing catching the last of the evening light. Neither of you wants the evening to end on this note, and slowly, tentatively, you begin working back toward each other, him asking more gently what the machine specifically means to you, inviting you to explain more fully rather than simply defending your position. You find yourself telling him, more patiently now, about watching your grandmother work at that exact machine throughout your childhood, the particular sound of its pedal, the specific quilts and dresses it produced over the decades, the quiet promise you made to yourself that you would keep it running for as long as possible. A small thread connecting you to a woman you love dearly and miss constantly. He listens more carefully this time, his expression softening as you speak, and when you finish, he admits quietly that he had not fully understood the weight the machine carried for you, assuming instead that your attachment was simply sentimental in a general sense rather than tied to such specific tender memories. In turn, you ask him more gently to explain his own hesitation, and he admits that the tight month genuinely worries him, that he carries his own quiet anxiety about managing the household responsibly, about proving himself capable of providing adequately even in difficult months. Understanding this, you find your own frustration softening considerably, recognizing that his hesitation was never truly about dismissing your grandmother's memory, but about his own genuine concern for the household's financial stability. By the end of the conversation, you arrive together at a modest compromise. The machine repaired this month, balanced by a small postponement of a different, less sentimental purchase you had both been considering. A new pair of curtains that can easily wait another few weeks. Neither of you leaves the conversation feeling entirely victorious, but something in the compromise itself feels genuinely fair, evidence that you're both learning to hold your own priorities honestly, while still making room for the others. Later, after the budget book has been closed and returned to its drawer, you find him examining the old sewing machine himself, running a careful hand along its worn casing, admitting quietly that he had not fully understood, until you explained it, how much the machine actually meant to you. You thank him for listening, and he thanks you in turn for helping him see past the simple arithmetic toward the sentiment underneath it, and something in this small, honest exchange leaves you both feeling closer than before the disagreement began. It is the kind of small friction that will likely repeat itself in different forms throughout your marriage. Sentiment weighed against practicality, one partner's priority balanced carefully against the other's, and you suspect, watching him gently examine your grandmother's machine, that these small negotiations, however uncomfortable in the moment, are simply another quiet mechanism through which two people slowly learn to build something durable together, one honest, occasionally difficult conversation at a time. By now you know the neighbourhood the way you know your own kitchen, the butcher who saves the better cuts for regulars, the exact hour the trolley grows crowded, the particular bench where old men gather each afternoon to argue gently about nothing in particular. It happens gradually, this deep familiarity, built through countless small errands repeated so often they've become entirely unremarkable. And yet looking back, you realise how thoroughly this neighbourhood has become woven into the ordinary fabric of your days. The butcher greets you now by name, setting aside the better cuts before you even arrive, having learned your preferences well enough to anticipate them without asking, occasionally slipping an extra bone into your parcel for soup stock, refusing payment for the small kindness, with a wave of his hand and a comment about how every young household needs a little extra help now and then. You know precisely which hour the trolley grows uncomfortably crowded, timing your own errands carefully to avoid the crush of workers heading home, and you know the particular creak of its brakes at the corner stop, a sound so familiar now it barely registers consciously anymore, blending into the general soundtrack of the neighbourhood the way a familiar song fades into background noise after enough repeated listening. You have learned, too, which conductor tends to wait an extra few seconds for latecomers, and which one departs precisely on schedule, regardless of who might still be hurrying toward the platform. The corner drugstore clerk knows which magazine you prefer, setting the latest issue aside without needing to be asked. And the woman who runs the small flower stand near the trolley stop always offers a genuine smile, remembering the small bouquet you purchased for your very first dinner party months ago, occasionally suggesting a particular arrangement she thinks might suit whatever occasion you mention in passing. She remembers small details about your household that even you sometimes forget you have shared, asking after your husband's health when he catches a slight cold, inquiring gently about how the sewing machine repair turned out after you mentioned the expense one afternoon while selecting a small bunch of daisies. There is a particular bench outside the hardware store where a small group of older men gather most afternoons, their gentle arguments drifting pleasantly through the open window as you pass, disagreements about baseball scores or neighborhood politics conducted with the easy familiarity of men who have known each other for decades. You've come to recognize their voices individually now, the gruffer one who always seems slightly exasperated, the quieter one who mostly listens, occasionally offering a dry, understated remark that sends the others into laughter, and a third, older still, who seems to serve as a kind of informal referee, settling disputes with a calm authority the others readily accept. The seasons themselves have taught you their own particular neighborhood rhythms, the way the corner bakery's smell shifts subtly as autumn approaches, cinnamon and nutmeg replacing the lighter fruit scents of summer, the way the trolley schedule adjusts slightly once the weather turns colder. Fewer riders lingering on the open platform between cars, more huddling instead just inside the doors. You know now which storefronts decorate earliest for the holidays, which neighbours keep their gardens most carefully tended, which particular stretch of sidewalk grows treacherously icy during the first hard frost. A small hazard you have learned to navigate carefully each winter morning. This accumulated knowledge feels different from anything you might have learned deliberately, arriving instead through the simple, patient repetition of ordinary errands, week after week, month after month, until the entire neighborhood has become less a collection of unfamiliar shops and streets, and more something closer to an extended informal community. Familiar faces greeting you warmly, small routines you now navigate without conscious thought. You realize, thinking back, that you could not have named half these details a year ago, when the neighborhood still felt foreign and slightly overwhelming, every errand requiring careful attention to unfamiliar street names and unfamiliar shopkeepers. You mentioned this once to your husband, this sense of having genuinely settled into the neighborhood rather than simply living within it, and he nods immediately, admitting he feels the same quiet familiarity, the same easy comfort walking these particular streets that once felt entirely foreign only a year ago. He mentions his own small store of neighborhood knowledge, the newsstand vendor who always saves him the last copy of a particular paper, the shortcut through the alley behind the bakery that saves several minutes on his walk home from the trolley stop. Small pieces of local wisdom accumulated entirely on his own during the hours you spend apart each day. It is the kind of belonging that develops slowly and without ceremony, built through nothing more dramatic than repeated small errands, and yet it leaves you both with a genuine, settled sense of home, extending now beyond your own small apartment into the streets and shops and familiar faces surrounding it. A whole small world that has quietly, patiently become yours. Nothing remarkable happens this particular evening. Only an ordinary dinner, ordinary conversation, ordinary quiet afterward. And yet sitting together in the softening light, you find yourself thinking that this, exactly this, unremarkable and simple, is precisely what you once hoped marriage might feel like. The evening begins in the usual unremarkable way, him arriving home at the usual hour, the familiar sound of his key in the lock, dinner already simmering on the stove from a recipe you've made often enough now that it requires little conscious attention, your hands moving through the familiar motions almost automatically, while your mind wanders freely elsewhere. Conversation over the meal drifts easily between small topics, a minor frustration from his workday, a funny exchange overheard at the market, nothing especially significant, simply the easy, accumulated comfort of two people who have learned each other's rhythms thoroughly enough that silence and conversation flow with equal ease between them. After dinner, the dishes are cleared in the same practiced choreography you established many months ago, him drying while you wash, neither requiring instruction anymore, the task completed with an efficiency that leaves ample time afterward for the evening's quieter pleasures. You settle together in the small living room, him with the newspaper, you with some small mending, the radio humming low in the background, and for a long while neither of you speaks at all, content simply to exist together in comfortable, companionable quiet. The only sounds the soft rustle of newspaper pages turning and the occasional small click of your needle against the thimble. You find yourself glancing up at one point, studying him in profile as he reads, the particular way his brow furrows slightly at some article, the small unconscious habit of running a hand through his hair when concentrating, and something in the ordinary intimacy of simply watching him, unnoticed, fills you with a quiet, settled happiness that feels entirely disproportionate to the unremarkable nature of the moment itself. This is nothing, you think, simply an ordinary evening indistinguishable in almost every way from dozens of others this year, and yet it feels, somehow, like precisely the thing you once hoped marriage might become, back when you were still an anxious bride, uncertain what daily life together might actually resemble. You think back briefly to those early anxious weeks, wondering whether you were truly prepared for this life, whether love alone would prove sufficient to navigate the daily friction of shared space and merged habits, whether the nervous excitement of the wedding day could possibly sustain itself through the countless ordinary evenings that would inevitably follow. Sitting here now, needle moving steadily through fabric, his quiet presence nearby requiring no particular effort or performance, you recognize how thoroughly those early anxieties have dissolved into something far simpler and more durable, the quiet, unremarkable comfort of genuine accumulated partnership. He glances up at one point, catching you watching him, and offers a small questioning smile asking what you're thinking. You consider deflecting the question with something light, but instead find yourself telling him honestly that you are simply sitting here, appreciating how ordinary and how deeply satisfying this particular evening feels, that this quiet, unremarkable domesticity is exactly what you once hoped for without quite knowing how to name it beforehand. He considers this for a moment, then admits that he has been thinking something similar himself, that evenings like this, requiring nothing dramatic or memorable, have quietly become his favourite part of each week. The evening continues without any particular event marking its passage. The newspaper eventually folded and set aside, the mending finished and returned to its basket, conversation resuming occasionally in soft, unhurried bursts before lapsing again into comfortable silence. There's no dramatic declaration exchanged, no significant milestone marked, only the simple, sufficient pleasure of two people sharing space easily, contentedly, without needing to perform anything beyond genuine presence, each entirely comfortable, simply existing quietly alongside the other. As the evening finally winds toward bedtime, you find yourself deeply grateful for precisely this, the unremarkable, ordinary comfort that has slowly become the genuine foundation of your marriage. It is the kind of contentment that rarely gets celebrated or remarked upon. Quiet evenings indistinguishable from one another, and yet you suspect, drifting finally towards sleep beside him, that this accumulated ordinariness, this steady, unglamorous comfort, is precisely what the truest, most durable happiness actually feels like. Built not from grand gestures, but from hundreds of quiet evenings just like this one, each unremarkable on its own, yet together forming something genuinely, deeply precious. On the evening of your actual anniversary, you find yourselves standing together at the same kitchen window where you once watched the first light of your earliest morning here. And looking out now at the familiar street below, you realize how completely this ordinary view has become simply, entirely your own. The evening arrives quietly, without any elaborate celebration planned, both of you having agreed weeks earlier that a simple dinner at home would suit the occasion better than anything more elaborate. A decision that felt entirely natural given everything you have learned this year about the particular richness found in ordinary, unhurried evenings together. The meal itself unfolds gently, a dish you have made many times now, familiar and comforting, prepared with the easy confidence that comes from a full year of practice rather than the careful, anxious attention required during those very first attempts at cooking for him alone. Afterward, dishes cleared and kitchen restored to its usual order, you find yourselves drawn toward the window almost instinctively. The same spot where you once stood on your very first morning here, disoriented and uncertain, still learning the shape of this new shared life. Tonight the view holds none of that earlier uncertainty. You recognize immediately the particular pattern of lit windows across the street, know which household keeps late hours and which retires early. Recognize the specific creak of the trolley 2 streets over as it makes its final evening run, each small detail so thoroughly familiar now that you could likely describe this view accurately with your eyes closed. The street itself, once entirely unfamiliar, now feels as thoroughly known to you as the rooms of your own small apartment, evidence of an entire year's accumulated familiarity settling comfortably around you both. He stands close beside you, his arm finding its way naturally around your shoulders, and neither of you speaks for a long moment, simply absorbing the quiet significance of the occasion without needing to name it aloud. The comfortable silence itself feeling like its own small tribute to everything this year has taught you about simply being present together. You think back, unprompted, over the small accumulated history of this first year, the nervous early mornings, the imperfect dinners, the small disagreements resolved through patient conversation, the quiet Sunday afternoons on the shared porch, each memory arriving gently without urgency, simply present alongside you in this shared moment of reflection. You think of the sewing machine, repaired and still humming faithfully in the next room, of the folded shirts that once brought unexpected tears, of the neighbourhood that has become so thoroughly familiar, each small memory another thread in the rich, accumulated fabric of this ordinary, extraordinary year. You mention finally breaking the comfortable silence, how strange it feels that an entire year has passed since you first stood at this exact window, uncertain and slightly overwhelmed by the newness of everything ahead. He nods slowly, admitting that he still remembers that first morning vividly, the smell of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, the particular quality of sunlight through the thin curtains, and yet admits too that the person standing beside him now feels different, somehow, from the anxious stranger he first woke beside, though he struggles to articulate exactly how, the change having arrived so gradually that no single moment marks its actual occurrence. You understand what he means without needing further explanation, recognizing the same shift within yourself, the accumulated confidence of an entire year spent learning to build something durable together, patient negotiation by patient negotiation, ordinary evening by ordinary evening. Neither of you is the same nervous, uncertain person who stood here 12 months ago. Though the change arrived so gradually, through such small accumulated moments that you can point to no single instance where the transformation actually occurred, only the slow, patient accumulation of an entire year's worth of ordinary days. You find yourself thinking, standing here together, of everything still ahead, the second year stretching forward with its own uncertain shape, more budget evenings, more small disagreements gently resolved, more quiet Sundays on the porch, more folded laundry and neighbourhood errands and ordinary dinners shared together. There is nothing frightening in this uncertainty now, only a quiet, settled confidence built entirely from this first year's patient accumulation of small, shared victories. Standing together now, the familiar street settling into evening beneath you, you feel a quiet, settled gratitude for everything this ordinary apartment has taught you both. Patience, compromise, the particular comfort of shared silence, the durable, unglamorous work of building something real together, one small decision at a time. Whatever the second year holds, you suspect, leaning slightly into his shoulder as the last light fades fully from the sky, you will face it with the same quiet confidence this first year slowly, patiently taught you both to carry, grateful simply for having learned, together, exactly what home actually means, and grateful too for all the ordinary years still ahead, waiting patiently to be filled with exactly this kind of quiet, accumulated love. And so we come to the end of this first year, the folded shirts and the budget book, the sewing machine humming again in the next room, the trolley pulling away right on schedule, the neighbours just beyond the wall settling into their own quiet evening. Nothing about any single day was remarkable. That was in its own way the whole point. Think for a moment about the people who actually lived this, who woke before 7 and made the coffee and learned slowly which side of the bed was theirs, who argued gently over a sewing machine and forgave each other by simply washing dishes side by side. They were not trying to build something worth remembering. They were only trying to get through an ordinary Tuesday with a little more kindness than the day before, and somehow, in doing that again and again, they built an entire life. There is something worth carrying forward from an era like this one, something small enough to fit into your own evening tonight. Maybe it is simply slowing down long enough to notice the person beside you. Maybe it is a shared meal with the radio turned low, or a Sunday afternoon spent doing absolutely nothing of consequence. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a screen door and a radio and someone down the street who knows your name, and that has always been enough. So tonight, as you pull the blanket up and let your eyes grow heavy, think of that small apartment, the chipped yellow cabinet, the porch chairs worn smooth by years of quiet Sundays. Let it remind you that a good life is rarely loud. It is built gently, one ordinary day at a time. Rest well, you have earned it.